talking about giving to God, as you see on the screen. Now, if you're thinking, well, I can be brave and tough it out for another 30 minutes and get through a giving sermon, bad news, this is only part one, so you got to get through next week, too. This is actually a great topic, and I think that it will be helpful to us not only to learn things that we can do better, but also to really get more out of what we're already doing. I think that the church here it is full of people who are generous and give regularly, and that's appreciated. But I want us to get a biblical picture of what giving looks like and how God sees it, because that's very important. So, this is it's an important topic. God talks about it a lot. Interestingly, we don't like talking about it, and we don't necessarily like hearing about it, but here we are together doing that. So, one thing I want to say at the front end of this is going to seem like an odd thing. I have no idea what any of you give. Okay, and the reason I was on the board for a long time. I'm newly appointed an elder, so I guess if I raised the stink and waved my hands, maybe I could, find out what the data said. But I want you to know that I have no idea, and the reason why I want you to know that is if I'm, get a point and I look at you, I got to look at somebody. If I'm looking at you, I don't want you sitting there thinking, well, he knows what I give and he doesn't like it. I have no idea. There's only two people in here I know what they give. That's me and Betsy, and sometimes I don't even know that. I get surprised. So, there you go. So I don't know what you give. Don't expect out of this 2-week series to get a bunch of rules or formulas or demands. That's not what this is about. So if you think you're going to be able to scratch down, okay, this is what I'm supposed to give to be okay, you're going to have to work at a heart level with God a little bit more to get there. Our goal is to see things the way God does, not in the typical way that our culture looks at giving. And we have some baggage about giving culturally that we have to overcome if we're going to get to where God is at on this issue. So that's what we're trying to accomplish. Even when we're talking about giving our money, we have to know that God has our best lives as what His intent is. Look, God doesn't need our money. He certainly doesn't need our stuff. Some of it's broken anyway. God doesn't need our money and our stuff. He's way beyond that. This is for our benefit more than God's, and so that's important to know. This thing is, can you bring me a battery? This thing's flashing at me. I think it's going to run out of juice. Two AAAs, I guess. So we'll keep going. It's good for now. There are going to be, you might have noticed I have kind of a chalkboard background on our presentation here today. So there's going to be 3 special chalkboards that we're going to keep throughout this class series. We're not only going to use them this week, we're going to carry them into next week. And we'll keep adding things onto these 3 special chalkboards. So here's the first one, the whys of giving. What motivated giving and sacrifices in the Bible? So we want to look at the whys. We want to look at the hows. How should we give? How should we sacrifice? How should we think about giving as we talk about that? And lastly, how we think about giving in terms of our culture. What are some general observations about how American culture tends to think about giving? Now, obviously, generalities don't apply to everyone, but they apply to a lot of folks. So, I'm under attack. Oh no, he's bringing batteries, per my request. I was ready to defend the stage. Now I'll just leave my pants on. Okay. See, that you can't get this kind of unscripted entertainment just anywhere. Okay. There we go. All right. So, those 3 things we'll carry along. All right. First, we're going to look at a lot of verses today. And so be ready to turn in your Bibles. I put a lot of them on the screen, but some of them are not on the screen. All right, the first one is in Genesis chapter 4. Now Abel kept flocks and Cain worked the soil. In the course of time, Cain brought some of the fruits of the soil in an offering, as an offering to the Lord, and Abel also brought an offering, fat portions from some of the firstborn of his flock. The Lord looked with favor on Abel and his offering, but on Cain and his offering he did not look with favor. So Cain was very angry, and his face was downcast. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it." Now, there's a few interesting things about this passage that we just read. One is, how did they know that they should make an offering? It's remarkable to me that even at this very early stage, an offering is something that's a known thing. I mean, we're talking about the first generation after creation. So perhaps they learned it from Adam and Eve. God is obviously talking to them directly, so maybe he told them. I don't know how they figured it out. But even at this stage, God is expecting an offering from men. I think that's interesting that it's that early. Second question, why was Abel's offering accepted while Cain's was not? Now, theologians have been arguing about this question for thousands of years. I don't think we're going to work that out in the next 5 minutes. There's some people that think, well, God only wanted the animal sacrifices. No, I don't think that's right, because as we all go along farther in the Bible, God required a lot of sacrifices of grain and other things like what Cain was offering. So I don't think that's the issue. I think that what makes the most sense to me, at least, and you can study it out yourself and come to your own conclusions, but I think what I see in the text is that Abel gave his very best. He gave fat portions. He gave top shelf stuff. In describing Cain's offering, it says he gave some of what he harvested. It doesn't seem to be distinguished from anything else that he had. And so I don't know that that's the case. Whatever it was, God explained to him that what you did was not acceptable and gave him an opportunity to remedy it. Instead, he decided to kill Abel. That was a bad choice. But one was accepted and one was not. So it wasn't just the fact that it happened. God had a certain thing in mind. Who benefited from this offering? Did God want a barbecue? Did God want a salad to go with it? I don't think God needed what they were offering. It was for their benefit. That's why the offering was made. So, first, why of giving? Let's go to our special chalkboards. Recognition that what they had came from God. Recognition that they gave, the reason why is because they needed to recognize that what they had came from God. The harvest of the soil came from God. The success they had in raising their livestock came from God. We hear about animals and harvest of food. We think grocery store. They thought bank. It was monetary to them. That was their currency. And so what they had in their life was given to them by God, and the offering reflected that. The how, it was gratitude. That was the motivation behind the offering. It was gratitude to God for the provision that he made in giving them the harvest and giving them the success in managing the livestock. And again, we see that Abel had an attitude that he wanted it to be excellent. He wanted it to be his very best. Maybe Cain did, maybe he didn't. I don't know completely. But regardless, that was the how they needed to do it. They needed to do it gratefully. How do we think about giving? Well, I kind of struggled with figuring it out on this one. But I think that a lot of times when we think about giving as supporting a cause that we feel good about. Now, that's fine. I mean, I think there are lots of causes that we like and that we give money to, and that's a good thing. But that's different than having a recognition that what I have comes from God, and I'm expressing gratitude to God through my gift. That's a deeper level. But I think a lot of times in our culture, this is how we think that, well, I like church, so I'm going to give some money there. It's a good cause. All right, second verse, Genesis chapter 14. This one is very intriguing. Genesis chapter 14, and we're going to read verses 18 through 20. There's more stuff around it, but for the sake of time, we'll limit our reading to this. Melchizedek is a really, really difficult character to get a full grasp on. There's very little actually said about him. There's more said about him in the New Testament than the Old. But people have all kinds of ideas about who he was, but we don't get a lot from the Old Testament text. But this is where it comes from. Then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was priest of God Most High. So that's important. We know that much about him. The Bible doesn't say he was a priest who claimed to be. He said he was a priest of God Most High. So that's who Melchizedek is. And he blessed Abraham, saying, "Blessed be Abraham by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, and praise be to God Most High, who delivered your enemies into your hand." Then Abram gave him a tenth of everything. Now, let me give you a little background about what's going on here. He's not called Abraham yet. That happens in the next chapter. But Abram has gone out to war against kings that took his nephew captive. And in the process of going out against these kings, he wins a battle and he takes a great amount of plunder. And so he has all of this plunder that he's taken from the battle. And so, here's Abram coming back from this battle, hauling all this plunder, and he runs across Melchizedek. Now, you've got to think about who Abram is. I mean, Abram is God's guy. I mean, you don't get much higher position than Abram has. I mean, he's called, this is really special. Abram is called God's friend. So Abram and God are like this. And yet Melchizedek comes along, and even though Melchizedek wasn't in the battle, he's coming in after the fact. Okay, he didn't pray over him before he went to the battle. He didn't do anything that he could get any credit for. He's God's priest, and Abram gives him a tenth of all the plunder. That's a lot of stuff. I don't know how much exactly, but it's a lot because it was a big deal. This made Abram a wealthy man. So here's some questions I have about this one. Again, this is an early example. Abram didn't have a church. He didn't have any special thing going on. I mean, this is early. Why did Abram give an offering of 10%? Well, I don't know completely. I wish I could give you an answer, but that number is going to come up a lot in what we talk about today. But he gave 10% to Melchizedek. To whom was he giving the offering? Oh, this is an important question. Did he meet Melchizedek and say, "Wow, this guy is impressive. I want to give him money"? I don't think so. He wasn't giving Melchizedek the money. He was giving the money to God. That's a big deal. I think a lot of times when we think about contribution, we think, "Oh, I'm giving money to the church." No, we're giving money at church. But if we're giving the right way, we always recognize that we're giving money to God. We need to be thoughtful about it. But that's who he was giving the offering to. Who blessed Abraham, or who blessed Abram and delivered him? Melchizedek didn't. Melchizedek pronounced the blessing, but the blessing came from God. The deliverance came from God. Again, the idea here is Abram recognized that he had had great success and had taken all this plunder because of God's blessing and God's provision. And so he gave back to God as an offering, as an expression of gratitude in that. Here's a question for you. Did Abram view this as a duty or a privilege? I tried to imagine, did Abram say, oh man, how did Melchizedek get in here? Now I got to give him 10%. I got caught. How do you feel when you pay your taxes? Does anybody in here have a noble enough heart that when you pay your taxes, you say, I am so lucky to be paying taxes. I am so grateful that I get to pay these taxes. You're a better person than me if you feel that way. I think that sometimes we think about contribution kind of the same way. Okay, I got to give. I don't think Abram felt that way. I think he looked at his life and saw what was going on and said, man, God has been so good to me. It's an honor to give back to him. I think that's how he approached things. What was Abram's ongoing relationship with Melchizedek, the priest of God? As far as I know, he never saw him again. It's not like he was putting a payment in so he would get regular service from Melchizedek. That's not, as far as I can tell, that's not how it worked. He gave it to God and went on his way, and as much as I can tell, they didn't have any interaction after that. Take that for what it's worth. All right, on our chalkboards, the whys of giving. We've got to... That doesn't make a lot of sense. We give realizing that we must rely on God. I have to clean up the grammar on that one before next week. Abram realized he had to rely on God, that's where the good stuff came from. The how of giving. He gave with humility. It's interesting. He's coming off the battlefield. I don't know if any of you have ever played contact sports or been in that circumstance, like a battle situation, maybe real life battle, or something that approximates it in our day-to-day life. But I mean, you've got adrenaline going. You're coming off the battlefield. You're dragging plunder. You're celebrating the victory. It's hard to have humility in that circumstance. I mean, usually you get the opposite reaction. I told you we were great. I knew we could do it. Abram said, that came from God. I need to be humble. What a great heart he had. How do we think about giving? Do we think about it as a duty to give some portion or percentage, or do we view it as a privilege? Do we view it as a privilege? That's how we should view it. Well, we just missed one of the... Okay, we'll move on. Oh, that was the third one. All right. Next passage. Sorry, I'm working with new technology. I've changed computers, so I'm using a different program. Third passage. Exodus chapter 8, verse 20. This one, I love it when you're doing a sermon and you get surprised by things. I don't know how many times I've read all these passages, but I've read them a lot. But there are aspects of what we're talking about today that were surprising to me. So the story here is this is Moses interacting with Pharaoh. And so as he's interacting with Pharaoh, he's making a request of Pharaoh. And God ends up doing something bigger and different, which was his plan all along. But as far as what Moses is asking for with Pharaoh, let's read what it says. We're going to pick up in verse 20. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Get up early in the morning and confront Pharaoh as he goes to the river, and say to him, 'This is what the Lord says, let my people go so that they may worship me. And then he goes on to say, if you don't, I'll send this plague. Now, and then look down in verse 26. Then Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron and said, go sacrifice to your God here in the land. But Moses said, that would not be right. The sacrifices we offer the Lord our God would be detestable to the Egyptians. And if we offer sacrifices that are detestable in their eyes, will they not stone us? Okay, so the ask of Moses to Pharaoh is, let us go so that we can worship. And what does worship mean? Now, let me ask you this to set this up. If after church today, somebody said to you, how was service? And they said, the worship was really great today. What meaning would you take from that? The worship was especially good today. What does that mean in our vernacular? Okay, the music was really good. Now, I hope you feel that way. But that's not what Moses is talking about when he says, we are going to go worship. He's talking about making sacrifices to God. And he's equating that to worship. That's really intriguing. Now, if I were to ask you, what did the sacrifices of the Old Testament represent? If I were to ask you, what do the sacrifices of the Old Testament represent? I think that we would immediately go to the idea of the cross and forgiveness, and that's how they dealt with sin in the Old Testament until Jesus came. Okay, and there's truth in that. A lot of the sacrifices were that. However, there were more sacrifices that were connected to the idea of contribution than there are sacrifices that are connected to the idea of communion. Does that surprise you? It surprised me. A tremendous number of the sacrifices, and we'll look at this a little bit more in a moment, but a tremendous number of the sacrifices were about giving to God. Now, there were special sacrifices that were related to forgiveness and offerings of blood that were a prequel to what was going to happen with Jesus. But a lot of the sacrifices that happened were related to what we would consider contribution. They were offerings to God. So let's look at some particulars. Okay, we already answered that. He asked to worship. They intended to worship through sacrifice. Do we equate giving and sacrifice with worship? Don't turn there, but in Romans chapter 12, this idea is alluded to. When Paul writes the Romans, he says, offer yourself as living sacrifice, which is your, depending on your translation, which is your spiritual worship, or which is your true worship. Offering a sacrifice is worship in the way that they thought. And so we often don't equate that. This is a common connection in the Bible. Here's an interesting thing that I got out of this. I think that we don't think about contribution very much when we give it. Especially nowadays with the modern world, a lot of us give through the app or digitally. We don't even put the check in and watch it disappear into the bag and say, well, there goes X number of dollars right there into the bag. I mean, it was kind of a tactical, physical thing to watch the check go into the bag. Now I just sit there and it's zinging out of my account somewhere. And I'm not against that. I mean, it's convenient. And, we were out of town last week. We didn't have to worry about getting our check to somebody. I like it. But the downside of it is we don't process it mentally and think, at this moment, I'm worshiping God by making an offering. We're missing out on something if we don't think that way. So here's my encouragement to you. If you give electronically, that's fine. But during the offering, take time to think about the fact that you're giving to God. to be grateful, to express to him how much you appreciate what he's done for you. Because if you don't, you miss out. You just paid a bill. You didn't get the heart of what God wanted. And I've done that. So this is a common connection in the Bible that we really need to latch onto. So, whys of giving. Giving is a way to worship God. The hows of giving. We should do it reverently. A lot of times, even in the way we structure services, I asked Adam, you probably sat there today and said, why are they singing a song after contribution? We don't usually do that. He picked out Jordan River. I said, I hope they don't think that means we got to contribute or we don't get across. I should have said, here I am to worship or something, giving you more direction. But I asked Adam, I said, do a song during contribution. Because a lot of times, contribution is a time that, we're gearing up to go to the fellowship break, or we're squeezing in an announcement, or, our mind is somewhere else. We're missing out. We should be thinking about what we're doing. It's one of the real important parts of our service. Not because, the church needs the money. We use the money, but it's important because we're making an offering to God. We're expressing something to God as we give. So let's make sure that we do that. So how we think about giving. I've already really talked about that. A lot of times for us, it's a quick, almost passive part of Sunday, and we don't pay much attention to it. So that's something we can improve on. Okay, next verse. By the way, we're not going to escape the Old Testament today, if you were wondering. Next week, we're going to talk a lot about the New Testament. But there's a lot of stuff in the Old Testament that's really helpful on this topic. You cannot understand giving and how we should think about money and how we should think about life unless you really dig into Deuteronomy chapter 8. I've got a couple of verses out of Deuteronomy chapter 8 up here, but the whole chapter is incredibly important. So that's your homework. Go back and read Deuteronomy chapter 8 in its entirety, because God really communicates his heart about this topic in Deuteronomy chapter 8. But I want to center in on this idea right here. In Deuteronomy chapter 8, starting in verse 17, and this is God, the Israelites are getting ready to go into the promised land, and God's about to give it to them. And so God tells them, look, I'm about to give you a land that's flowing with milk and honey and olive oil. He made sure to mention that. You're going to have all this. It's going to go well for you, and you're going to have land, and you're going to have possession, and things are going to be good, but don't forget about me. Okay, that's a lot of what the chapter is addressing. And so God warns them. He says, you may say to yourself, once you're established in the land, you may say to yourself, my power and the strength of my hands has produced this wealth for me. But remember the Lord your God, for it is he who gives you the ability to produce wealth and so confirms his covenant, which he swore to your ancestors as it is today. Okay, so let's get into this. There is a very important idea that I don't have time to get into today, but it's part B of your homework assignment. Go to an app that you use, Bible Gateway or whatever search app, or if you're old school, dig out your concordance, and look up this word, first fruits. It's a long list of verses you'll get. Now, you'll get a few in the New Testament, but you'll get a lot of them in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. The reason you get a lot of them there is because that's where God is giving the law, and there were a lot of laws that were based on this idea. The first fruits of whatever you have belong to me. That's God speaking. And so that's the context of the context of this passage is how we think about wealth and where it comes from. But God, in talking about the first fruits, says, look, the first fruits are mine. The commands that he called the Israelites to remember God through tithes and offerings. So a lot of the sacrifices and tithes were talked about in these commands. They had to bring them in and give them. They provided for the Levites and the temple and a lot of things. So a lot of the feasts and festivals were centered around this idea of tithes and offerings and sacrifices. These tithes, this is something that we don't necessarily connect, but these tithes and offerings were holy to God, set apart to God. They were reserved for God. So we think of holiness, when we talk about holiness, a lot of times we think of holiness as I'm behaving well. I didn't do bad stuff today, so I had a holy day. That's how we think about holiness. And yet, holiness really, at its root, means that it's set apart for God. And so God considered those things His, set apart for Him, and they needed to fulfill their obligation. So the whys of giving. Remember that God is the source. Thank you for saving that. I've preached several times. I've never had somebody's wife come up and save their guitar on stage while I was preaching. Let's give Victoria a hand for saving the guitar. Nobody wants a soggy Martin. We need to remember that God is the source of everything. That's the point of these things that God has called us to. The hows of giving. Recognize that we depend on God. We don't like that idea. We don't admit that, but we don't like the idea that I'm dependent on God. And yet that's what is really reflected in the offerings that we're called to in these verses. So how do we think about giving? A lot of times we think that we are successful because of our hard work. Like that verse says. You see, now I've got rhythm when I preach. If the rain slows down, the sermon's going to be longer. But we think that we have success through our work and we'll give some of our dollars. We don't live life a lot of times recognizing that what we have comes from God and we need to honor Him with the first fruits of what we get. So that's an important concept. Okay, last grouping for today. There's 3 of these. 2 of them we're not going to read. Haggai 1, verses 2 through 11, is God addressing His people about building the temple. And what's going on in Haggai is the people have come back from exile, and the people come back from exile, and they've gone back to the city, and they're building their houses, but they're saying it's not time to build the temple yet. And so God confronts them and He says, is it time for you to build your fancy paneled houses while my house lies in ruins? And then he says something that's very interesting. He says, think about your life. You work hard and get money only to put it in a purse that's got holes in it. You put on clothes, but you're not warm. You grow crops, but you're still hungry. God says, you're neglecting me, and because of your neglect of me, you're not satisfied. Even though you're trying to keep things for yourself, it's not working out for you. That's the gist of Haggai. Then there's Malachi chapter 1, verse 6 through 14. The gist of Malachi 1 is that they're bringing sacrifices, but they're bringing bad sacrifices. They're bringing the wounded animals, the sickly animals. They don't want to give God the good stuff. They give Him what they don't want or need. And God says, look, why don't you try giving those to the governor and see if he'll accept them? I think you'll find he will not. He says, you dishonor me by giving me the bad stuff, by giving me the leftovers. I should get your best. I should get your first fruits. So they're dishonoring God. And then the one we're going to read is Malachi chapter 3, verse 6 through 12. This is God speaking to the Israelites. He says, will a mere mortal rob God? Yet you rob me. Now, my guess is that if I got up here and I wagged a finger at the church and said, you guys are robbing God, you would respond exactly the same way that they did. But you ask, how are we robbing you? You know, you'd say, wait a minute, I haven't broken into the church. Don't worry, there's no money in the church office. Don't break in there. I haven't broken into the church and stolen stuff. I'm not robbing God. How am I robbing God? This is God's response to them. In tithes and offerings, you are under a curse, your whole nation, because you are robbing me. Bring in the whole tithe into the storehouse, that there may be food in my house. Test me in this, says the Lord Almighty, and see if I will not throw open the floodgates of heaven and pour out so much blessing that there will not be room enough to store it. Wow, what an interesting verse. Here's my first question that I struggle with when I read this verse. Is this a prosperity gospel message? You know, I frequently talk badly about the idea of prosperity gospel. You know, you give $20, you get 40 back. I don't like that kind of preaching. But this is God talking, so I'm not going to be critical. God says, I don't think it's prosperity gospel. I think that it's God. I think this is a poverty gospel message. God says, if you don't honor me, if you ignore me, if you don't do what I've told you to do, it's not going to go well for you. That's why your nation is suffering, because you don't honor me. And so God's admonition to them is, bring in the whole tithe. Now, we'll get in next week to the whole notion of tithing and whether that's a New Testament concept or not. That's not my point. My point is how we think about God and how we think about money. Are we holding out on God? Am I holding out on God? God says, bring in the whole thing and I will bless you. If you don't, I will not bless you. So God links honoring him in our giving to his blessing. And the reverse of that is also true. Sacrifices and offerings reflect our heart to God. So we're not just talking about money. How I interact with God. Do I sacrifice my time? Do I sacrifice my energy? Do I sacrifice my emotional capacity? Do I sacrifice my money? Do I give to others? How I do those things is not a reflection on my good character. It's a reflection on how my heart is towards God. And so it's an important issue because of that. You know, all the stuff we've looked at in the Old Testament is in the Old Testament today. But here's what I want you to remember. God's nature didn't change. God didn't become a Christian in the New Testament. You know, his nature didn't change. He expects to be honored. He expects us to treat him a certain way, and that didn't change. Now, there were definitely things that, as far as the particulars, that changed between the Old Testament and the New Testament, and that's called out very clearly in the Scriptures. But giving to God, honoring God, loving God, and treating him with respect is not one of those things that changed between the Testaments. So let's look at our 3 special chalkboards on this one. The whys of giving, to show honor to God and to show that he's our first priority, not where we get rid of our leftovers. Hows of giving, respectfully and completely. Don't do it in half measures. Do it respecting God and bring in the whole thing, God said. How we think about giving. This is how a lot of people think, and I've thought this way before. If I give less, I'll have more. Now that makes logical sense, doesn't it? I mean, if I have $100, and since we're reading about tithes there, I'll do the math. $10. Okay, if I got $100 and I give God $10 because that's a tithe, I'm going to have how much left? Now, see, this is a smart audience. They got to 90 right away. If I have $100 and I give God 5 instead of 10, how much am I going to have left? Now, is 95 more or less than 90? It's more, right? So that makes sense to us. If I give less, I'll have more. But the problem is we take God out of the equation when we think that way. And we take time out of the equation when we think that way. What God is telling the Israelites in Malachi is, yeah, you may have more today, but if you honored me, I would bless you. And you'd be way ahead in the game. That's what God is telling them. And I think that still holds true in our life. All right, next week, we're going to look at New Testament teachings and examples on giving. So we're going to get more into what we're used to in terms of that subject matter. We're going to talk about specifics of giving at Campusview. Don't worry, we're not going to talk about you in front of everybody. I still won't know what you're giving. But we're going to talk about giving in generalities at Campusview. And I'm going to share with you some interesting things statistically that I think will be instructive to us. And then we're going to talk about the application of the verses we looked at this week and the ones we'll look at next week to our day-to-day lives, what we need to do to put things into practice. So that's what you can look forward to. I hope that the things that we've talked about today have been helpful to you and they make you think a little bit. That was the goal of the lesson today, because that's what it did for me. It really made me think about how God feels and what he expects of me and how he looks at giving. It's more important than I recognized it when I started studying for this class. God views it as worship. God views it as a way to honor him, and it's something that's there for our benefit. So I hope these things are helpful to you. We're going to have one song to close out, and thank you very much.